Hello, everybody. So nice to see some really old friends in the audience and former colleagues, and really wonderful to be here in these wonderful new premises. Congratulations again, Alistair, Richard, Zara, for what is really a fantastic facility. So welcome everyone to this seminar on South Asia. Welcome to all of you with us in the room and to our remote audience and our remote panelists, as well as our panelists with us here on the stage. I open by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and acknowledge their continued connection to land, water and community. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend this to all Indigenous peoples in the room with us today. It's been a great pleasure for AsiaLink to partner for the third time with the AIIA Victoria alongside DFAT, the Australia-India Institute, the Australia-India Chamber of Commerce on this South Asia seminar series. It is a great example of a valuable partnership between organisations which share the same objectives in strengthening connections into a region of global importance and deep significance for our shared Indo-Pacific region. This is the second of 3 seminars we are presenting with our partners. Today, we have a great lineup of experts who will delve into security issues in the Indo-Pacific region, preeminently from a South Asia perspective, but also from an Australian perspective. Of course, the challenges are multifaceted and complex. This is a vast region comprising a diverse array of nations with unique geopolitical interests. It is at the epicentre not only of tremendous economic growth, but also geostrategic competition and a cauldron of multiple security dilemmas. South Asia is deeply affected by conflicts in the Ukraine and the Middle East, as well as the US-China strategic competition in the Northern Pacific. Our panel will address these in detail, but here are a couple of snapshots of the challenges that we face. Despite the Russia-Ukraine conflict playing out primarily on Ukrainian territory, the war has had significant impact on countries in the global south, particularly in terms of economic stability, food security, energy costs and needs. The rising fuel prices alone, as a result of this war, have destabilised economies and increased inflationary pressures. According to the International Energy Agency, by January 2023, India was the world's 5th largest oil importer and could face an increase in its current account deficit due to higher oil prices. And even though India has been able to shield its economy to an extent from the energy crisis by avoiding Western sanctions and purchasing Russian oil at a more affordable price, it has still been affected by rising global food prices, resulting in inflation, reduced tourism revenues, and challenges in accessing international capital markets. Pakistan has seen a sharp increase in the prices of semiconductors, food, commodities, and gasoline, leading to economic turmoil. Bangladesh has seen severe inflationary stress, a decline in foreign exchange, and a current account deficit. The diversion of international attention from Afghanistan to Ukraine has allowed the Taliban to consolidate its power in the country, with actions and atrocities going not very well reported in the media at all. Nepal and Bhutan have also been affected by the war, with a decline in the value of their currencies, increasing food prices, and decreasing foreign remittances and European tourists. The decline in tourists from Russia and Ukraine has negatively affected the Maldives and Sri Lankan tourism industries, tourism revenue, and foreign reserves. Few conflicts have resonated as deeply and for as long as the Palestine-Israel conflict, where South Asia has historical, cultural, religious, and economic ties with the Middle East. The impact of a widening of the Gaza war would be especially severe for South Asian nations. Apart from the impact on critical energy supply and costs through a possible intensification of hostilities between Saudi Arabia and Iran, millions of South Asian migrants work in the Middle East. An intensification of hostilities arising from the Gaza conflict has the potential to affect their security and incomes and ability to send critical remittances to their home countries. The Middle East is also the destination for a large quantity of South Asian exports. The Indo-Pacific sea lanes and strategic choke points are a critical route for global trade and energy flows. From the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea to the spectre of nuclear escalation between a number of regional players, The security dynamics of this region are deeply intertwined with broader geopolitical rivalries and power projections. As the world's two preeminent powers driving for influence and supremacy, countries in South Asia find themselves caught in the cross-currents of US-China geopolitical competition, with significant implications for regional security and economic interdependence. South Asian nations must navigate this delicate balancing act, avoiding entanglement in great power conflicts while safeguarding their own national interests and unlocking the region's full potential for prosperity and cooperation. So as stakeholders in this dynamic landscape, South Asian nations do need to seize the opportunity to shape the future trajectory of the Indo-Pacific, promoting peace, stability, and economic development where they can and for the benefit of all. And today we look forward to hearing four perspectives on how that might be achieved, but also on what the challenges will be to get there, if you can get there at all. Our four speakers will each make a presentation of around 8 minutes duration, followed by a 15 to 20-minute panel discussion, which I will moderate. Then it'll be over to you, the audience, where you will have around 20 minutes to ask your questions in person and via the Q&A section for our remote participants, which will be moderated by Alistair. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who will be coming to us from India, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. If I may call you Anil, because we were children together in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva when we were both doing arms control and disarmament negotiations. But Ambassador Anil Wadhwa will now give us an 8-minute briefing on the Indian perspective on these numerous challenges which we have discussed today. Over to you, Anil.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martine. It's a pleasure to be here and to see you moderating this session. Indeed, we were children together in the Conference of Disarmament many, many years ago. You've done a fantastic job of summarizing what the issues are, at least as far as the South Asian countries are concerned. There are many more challenges in the region. It's so innumerable that it's so difficult to recount them in such a short period of time. So what I'm trying to do is to recount them from the Indian perspective, and there'll be other perspectives which will complement this. Now, as you know, as far as India is concerned, the Indo-Pacific is a construct which stretches from the Western Pacific to the shores of East Africa. It's a very vast expanse as far as India is concerned. And there are a number of security challenges in the sub-regions. But divide them into sub-regions, it's easier to break them up into sub-regions that way. First is the East China Sea, where Japan has been a strong proponent of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and that Japan is locked in a territorial dispute with China over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands with China, where there are continuing provocations caused by intrusions of Chinese vessels in its EEZ. Second is the South China Sea issue, which you also raised. Now, as we all know, China claims almost 80% of the South China Sea today, which is one of the world's busiest lanes, challenging freedom of navigation and unimpeded flow of trade and commerce. And lately, the Chinese political and economic influence, as well as naval presence in the region, has continued to grow. It has rapidly moved to occupy, to militarize, and in some cases populate and reclaim 32,000 acres in the South China Sea. We know that it has disregarded an ICJ judgment in a case brought by Philippines. And now the advent of a new government in Taiwan has exacerbated tensions in Taiwan Straits, coupled with the Chinese pronouncements and belligerence over the last few years in the straits around Taiwan. Because it's been made clear by China that it would like Taiwan to be incorporated into the Chinese fold, either peacefully or forcefully. Taiwan's neighbors and those with economic dependencies on it, especially for chips and semiconductors, like the United States, need a strategy, coordination, and a will to act in case a forceful incorporation of Taiwan gets underway, even as many countries recognize the One China principle. Third is the Western Pacific, closer to you, Australia, and China has taken BRI projects to many islands there, like Fiji. There have been rumors of them seeking a naval base, starting with Vanuatu. But there is no doubt a rising influence and presence of China in the islands. Solomon Islands and Kiribati have decided to recognize China at the expense of Taiwan. Chinese influence in the Pacific Island states will continue to grow and pose a challenge to the United States, to Australia, Japan, and New Zealand in particular. Fourth region is the ASEAN itself, where ASEAN countries in June 2019 adopted the ASEAN Outlook to the Indo-Pacific. Now, this document walks a very fine line between China and the United States, and the focus is on implementing the existing ASEAN priority areas of cooperation, like maritime cooperation, connectivities, SDGs, etc. Critical to it has been the maintaining of ASEAN centrality. So clearly, ASEAN would clearly not like to take sides in a conflict. The Malacca Straits, in particular, connect the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, and it is through these straits that over 40% of India's seaborne trade passes. India also has energy interests in the region. Maritime domain awareness is crucial in protecting sea lanes of communication and to meet the demand of the growing convergence between ASEAN and India in tracking the development of naval vessels and ships in the South China Sea. So in this context, the straits of in Malacca, Lombok, Sunda, they all hold a key Indian interest in the region. And collaboration for intelligence sharing between Singapore Information Fusion Center and India's Information Management and Analysis Center for enhanced maritime domain awareness and sharing of movement data for submarines, for example, has helped develop India's maritime surveillance capabilities in the Indian Ocean. Fifth is the Indian sub-region, including Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. Now, this is a region located at the crossroads of the northern Indian Ocean, which harbors the principal sea lanes of the world and the Andaman Sea, the bridgehead to the Malacca Straits. And it's of great strategic significance and importance to India because 95% of its trade, 83% of its energy requirements flow through it, as also 80% of global oil and gas supplies. And the Indian subcontinent and its periphery is also experiencing the ambitious projection of Chinese power seen in its investments in Chaobyo in Myanmar, Sonadia in Bangladesh, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and Gwadar in Pakistan. All these are ports and its maneuvers also in the Maldives. There is simultaneously a growing presence of the Chinese Navy in the northern Indian Ocean with 6 to 8 naval ships and submarines in the region at any given point in time. The sixth is the Arabian Sea. The littoral of the Arabian Sea is unquestionably one of the hotspots in the world, which is driven by historical rivalries and contemporary disputes exacerbated by outside powers. And the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea threaten countries now of the Indo-Pacific, which depend on a free passage through the straits of Bab el-Mandab and Hormuz for their oil and gas supplies. China appears to have used the opportunity of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA and ensuring sanctions to strengthen ties with Iran. It has also moved closer economically to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, gaining an influence at the cost of the United States. Seventh is the Western Indian Ocean, and the westernmost reach of the Indian Ocean includes 10 East African coastal and island states. It's an area which has assumed importance due to the potential of the region's marine resources, the extractive industry, rich fisheries, oil and gas deposits, geographical location, straddling key sea lanes, and as a gateway to the African mainland. And this is an area where global powers such as the United States, France, China, and even Japan have jostled for a foothold through bases such as in Djibouti and tie-ups with strategic objectives and also ostensibly to tackle non-traditional challenges. The African Union has declared the Eastern Seaboard as the front line of the African Renaissance and given prominence to the development of a blue economy. So these are the 7 sub-regions that I wanted to outline for you. But now coming back to the Chinese naval capacity, and that is to protect its overseas interests in sea lanes of communication, that is projected to increase. China is contracting additional aircraft carriers, a powerful nuclear-powered fleet of submarines, and has moved to strengthen its air power at the same time. But its energy supplies are vulnerable, and it is therefore seeking access to the Bay of Bengal to Myanmar in order to have an alternate supply line to the Malacca Strait. However, this can only partially offset its Malacca dilemma, since the energy to be transported for China will grow further. In future, therefore, the PLA Navy is bound to deploy more ships in the Indian Ocean region to defend its own sea lanes of communication. And the presence of Chinese naval ships and submarines will raise new dilemmas for India. China today possesses enormous economic resources and increasing military power. Coming to the India-China border in 2020, after China reneged on the 6 different agreements which were reached painstakingly with India in the 1990s and the early 2000s to maintain peace and tranquility on the undemarcated border, India has responded by matching Chinese buildup of troops and permanent settlements as well as villages on the border in equal measure and strengthening its own infrastructure in the border areas. It has also moved to strengthen the naval presence in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at the mouth of the Malacca Straits, and it is from here that the Indian Navy can play a vital role in the maritime domain. Now, as you know, the Indian Navy conducts the biennial Milan exercise with navies of the Indian Ocean region at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And these initiatives, coupled with exercises like Malabar between India, US, Australia, and Japan, have built up a system which is moving towards greater interoperability. Overall, the Chinese actions in the region have led, in my view, to a natural reaction and a backlash. The gap between the Chinese and US capabilities in areas that will be future determinants, such as artificial intelligence, robotics, and new technologies, and civilian and military use seems to be narrowing. Now, in the circumstances, the Quad, the AUKUS, or some other mechanism which pools the strength of other like-minded countries is seen as the best hope of sustaining a rules-based order in the region by the United States and its allies. Not everybody agrees with that, though, but that is the current situation. As the asymmetries vis-a-vis China have grown, smaller states in the Indo-Pacific have started hedging. And countries like Australia, like France, India, Japan, and the EU, and individual EU countries by themselves have all come up with their own individual regional strategies for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. So the other aspect of this is that the ambitious BRI plans of China have resulted in debt traps for some nations because of unsound principles of economics, but are although they are unsuited to the host country, but they serve the Chinese geopolitical ends. So this also needs an alternative from the other players in the region. And there have been steps taken by other countries like the United States, Japan, India, Australia, and the EU to counter the Chinese BRI narrative, but these have so far not been enough. Also, vulnerability of ASEAN countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand, etc., to the lure of Chinese-funded projects and their deeper incorporation into the Chinese economic system remains the foremost likely possibility. And a similar possibility exists, in my view, in South Asia and in the Middle East, unless a viable alternative is available for countries of the region. So in the interest of time, I will end here. Thank you very much, Martin.
Ambassador Waldrop, for that mind-blowing array of issues, and there will be a test on everything that he's spoken about later on this evening. It's a very rich list. I should have explained, by the way, I'm not reading out everybody's bios because you have copies of them in front of you. So in the interests of time and because there's so much to listen to and talk about, I will simply introduce our next speakers. And our next speaker will be Dr. Chulani Atanayake. And would you like to come to the podium? Would you prefer to make your presentation from the seat? So we look forward to hearing from you. And a reminder, 8 minutes, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction and for the AIIA for the invitation to speak again this year. Okay, let me see. Okay. Martin already gave a brief overview of what's happening in the region and how these conflicts in Russia and Ukraine and also in the Middle East, in particular Israel and Iran, is impacting the South Asian region. So what I would do is I will be giving the perspective of probably small countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. Um, and in terms of doing that, when I define small countries, it's not the literal term to mean their geographical size or anything. It's how they perceive themselves in the international system, and also as compared to the regional superpower India. So my perspective will also provide what are the issues in terms of economy and terrorism and security for these countries. So both the Russia-Ukraine war and Israel war has major impact on South Asian economies in particular. Um, Small South Asian countries, Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal, these countries have varied degrees of relationship with these four countries which are in war at the moment. And as a result of the ongoing conflict, supply chain disruption, and the sanction on Iran and Russia, small countries are facing rising fuel prices, increasing inflationary pressure, and destabilizing economy. The conflicts have greatly impacted the tourism industry in these countries, particularly Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Maldives, and it has impacted the remittance receiving from migrant workers. For instance, as a result of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, Bangladesh has faced severe shortage in natural gas, leading them to shutting down of all 10 of its 10 diesel power plants. Bangladesh was growing at a very favorable 6% growth rate the entire decade, even surpassing India. But right now it is under severe inflationary stress and experiencing a rapid decline in foreign exchange, and a current account deficit. The Bangladeshi taka has depreciated 25% against the dollar, and the inflation has crossed 10%. In Nepal, prices of commodities such as soybean, palm oil, fuel have increased significantly, leading to price-based inflation in the country. The major impact of Russian-Ukraine conflict for these small countries are in the tourism industry. Nepal's foreign exchange reserve fell due to foreign income decreased as a result of the shortfall of tourist arrival. The Maldives is experiencing the effect because of in this conflict has drastically reduced the tourists coming from European countries, Russia, and Ukraine. Russia contributes to the second largest number of tourists visiting Maldives. Ukraine is among the top 10. While the tourists from Ukraine and Russia have completely ceased, tourists from countries like Germany and France have reduced in great numbers. Now, everyone knows about Sri Lanka's economic crisis that has been going on in the past couple of years. This is a complex affair. However, Russia and Ukraine war have had some effect on its economic crisis as well, especially because Sri Lanka, one of the major incomes for foreign reserve for Sri Lanka is tourism, and Russia and Ukraine tourism has declined significantly in the country. In 2019, Russia contributed to 34% of tourists in Sri Lanka before the war, and it has drastically reduced at the moment. However, there's another side to the tourist issue in Sri Lanka at the moment. According to some recent reports, Ukraine and Russian nationals arriving in Sri Lanka on a tourist visa have been staying for more than 2 months, which they get visa for, and they have been running informal enterprises outside of domestic regulatory reach. As a result of this, there has been many social and economic concerns that have garnered the attention of the government. Recently, the government had to cancel visa for those who are staying alone. Particularly, recent party they have called as White Tony Party has garnered a lot of social concern in the country, which gave highlight into this particular issue. Now, Iran-Israel war brings different set of challenges for these countries. They mainly impact the energy markets and the inflow of remittances. According to global energy analysts, Israel-Iran tension have a 40% probability of disrupting shipping and oil trade at the Strait of Hormuz. And each day, approximately 20 million barrel of oil and refined products travel through these Strait of Hormuz. And as a result of the disruption, there's high oil prices that has a ripple effect of the South Asian economies, leading to escalation of transportation costs, straining essential services and businesses. This conflict has already doubled the freight cost to USD 500 per 40 container per day by the end of 5,000, sorry, USD 5,000 by the end of 2023. And there is concern this could again double to 10,000 USD, and which will affect in shipping cost, affecting the international trade for these smaller countries. This also negatively impacted the tourism industry again, because as we know, the fuel price is closely related to the air cost, air travel, and that will divide the people's interest in traveling to these countries. The major other concern is the prospect of this conflict spilling over to the Middle East, the rest of the region. There is a significant number of migrant workers from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal working in the Middle East, bringing the majority portion of foreign remittance for these countries. A potential conflict in the region could lead for these workers to return or disrupt their employment, leading to eventual decline in remittance inflow. It can also lead to other domestic issues such as then increased unemployment, etc., which will strain the economy. Now, one of the major security concerns that has the potential from Israel in Iran conflict is the influence on the militant groups in South Asia. Groups aligned with or supported by Iran, such as certain factions of Afghanistan and Pakistan, might increase their activities in response to what's happening there in the region. Terrorist organizations such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed and others have historically close ties with certain groups in the Middle East region. Possible spillover of Iran-Israel conflict also can provide further room for terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda to spread the extremist ideologies. We know that these groups use sophisticated online mechanisms to spread their ideologies. A very recent report of 4 Sri Lankans being arrested in India who have planned, suspected to have planned an attack in India, tells us that this is an ongoing problem, and then that extremism and radicalization is a regional challenge that we have to address together. While countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are making an effort to curb radicalization through allocation of resources, introducing new laws and regulations, this has not been easy. For one, it increased government spending on defense and arm acquisition, and that put additional strain to their already fragile economies, impacting funding that can be allocated for other services such as education and health. In the meantime, increased domestic security measures to legal or otherwise to address these terrorism and radicalization has impacted civil liberty. Especially in Sri Lanka, a recent law that Anti-Terror Act and online an act against online radicalization has generated a lot of attention in the public, and the civil society organizations are quite concerned that their space to operate, their democratic rights can be strained because of these acts. Now, the Russian-Ukraine conflict also have really reveals to have a connection with human smuggling in the recent months, particularly in Sri Lanka. A recent report revealed that ex-soldiers are being recruited and mobilized to fight Russia in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Over 200 are believed to have died, and a similar number are in hospitals. So these people are being recruited to work as camp helpers, to provide supporting services for the fighting groups, but then they are being given 2-week training and have put them on the battleground. So these are less focused issues, but very concerning. And the reason why, if you look at why Sri Lankan ex-soldiers decide to go, that's because of their economic condition in the country at the moment. So in my perspective, all these things are interrelated, even though Sri Lanka is far away from both, geographically far away from both Iran and Israel conflict or the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the ripple effects can be felt home. Given the time, I think I will not be able to touch upon the geopolitical concerns. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Troni, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. What a fascinating tapestry of interconnectedness you've presented to us. We're going to move our focus a little bit now towards ASEAN. Obviously, one of the regions that Anil did speak about, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicholas Farrelly, the Pro Vice Chancellor at the University of Tasmania. And you are speaking to a presentation, or is that just our slide there Nick?
Yes, thanks, Martine. I've got some slides that I'm looking to share, if that works with everybody in the room.
To actual 8 minutes, if we can. Thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thanks very much, Martine. Great to see you and great to be involved in another wonderful event that's being produced by AsiaLink in partnership with such a great group of Melbourne-based institutions. Thanks very much to Alistair and the AIIA Victoria team for the invitation, and great, Bryce, to have you in the room as well. I'd also like to acknowledge my old Bangladesh, Myanmar interlocutor, Mohammed Chowdhury, who I know is there, along with many other old friends. We've already heard two really insightful and rich presentations. And as Martine has indicated, I'm going to be seeking to draw some threads together here from South Asia, yes, also through Southeast Asia, and then I hope into illuminating some Australian perspectives on the most significant global security issues that we all face today. Part of the context for my presentation is a report that I co-authored with an Indonesian, Cambodian, and a Singaporean scholar, which was launched in Melbourne on the eve of the ASEAN Australia Special Summit back in March. And so what I'm really hoping to do today is to explore some of the questions around what we agree on, of course, but also where there are levels of disagreement, particularly across the vastness of South and Southeast Asia, and what that might all mean for the ways that we are going to be able to work things through in the years and decades to come. And I can just see there, Alistair, that you have your hand up. I just wanted to check that everything's okay in the room.
It's all good.
All good, perfect, wonderful. All right, on that then, let me move ahead. And my big question is, how much do we all agree on the big questions? And I'm not going to labour the academic theory on this right now, but I think fair to say, looking at the ways that countries position themselves at the UN General Assembly and in similar bodies allows us to get to grips with the levels of cohesion that might exist, but also where there are, I suppose, matters of significant discord. And so you can see here the kinds of questions that are illuminating my analysis here this evening. I'm interested in where and when the countries across South and Southeast Asia agree and disagree, with a particular focus on Palestine, Ukraine, Myanmar, and Iran. I wonder if there is a common position, including inside ASEAN, and then what that also might suggest for various South Asian efforts to have common positions on some of these most significant security challenges. And then in a more speculative mode, I just might conclude Martine, and everybody there in the room with a few brief comments about what any of this might suggest for security futures across the Indo-Pacific region. So I'm going to have a few slides just like this. I'll put them up relatively briefly, but a lot of the points are quite obvious. So here we've got the ASEAN 10, followed by Timor-Leste, followed then in italics by the key South Asian countries, and then Australia. You can see here very clearly that of this sample, Australia was the only country back in December 2022 that voted against a resolution targeting Israeli practices, including security practices in the occupied territories. You can see, though, the range mostly of yeses and abstentions from the other countries sampled. As we move through this, though, what's very clear is that there is almost unanimous support across this group for the range of motions that have been put in the UN General Assembly in recent times focused on the Palestine question. I think this is important given what I'm about to say about some of the key areas of discord that are emerging simultaneously. So speaking of discord, we have, of course, the complexity of the Ukraine situation. And I thought it worthwhile here to start with the March 2014 vote of the General Assembly. You can see a wide range of different perspectives across the ASEAN 10 plus Timor and then the South Asian nations. I think a really interesting pattern emerges over time as different countries are getting all sorts of different pushes and pulls from their allies, from some of their neighbours, from other countries that are seeking to influence the outcomes at the UN General Assembly level. Of course, we know that each one of these resolutions can be drafted slightly differently. There are matters of nuance, context, history, all the rest. But if you start to look closely at what's going on here, we see Australia, of course, very consistently voting to support broadly the Ukrainian position as it is being managed at the UN level. And then we can see all of these other countries seeking to make a variety of different accommodations, both with, in this case, the ASEAN bloc, and for the South Asian countries seeking to obviously manage their politics on the global stage. When we come back into the Indo-Pacific and we look at perhaps what has proved to be among the most sensitive issues at the UN level that has required recent management, we've got the two General Assembly votes, one from December 2020, which I'll just emphasize was before Myanmar's February 2021 military coup, and then the vote itself from June 2021, which was mostly about the implications of the coup itself. Really interesting set of patterns emerge here, of course, where while yes, we are reminded regularly of the need to focus on ASEAN centrality and what that means of the regional security architecture, but we see pretty clearly here that there is not a consensus, and there hasn't been a consensus around some of these challenging issues that are put forward in the UN General Assembly context. Those abstentions across the South Asian countries in the wake of the February 2021 military coup are, I think, illustrative and useful in terms of the kind of attention that we might be wanting to give these big geopolitical questions this evening. And then finally, just as I give you one more slide with the voting record, this is the most recent resolution, part of a long series that the UN General Assembly has considered on Iranian human rights. And this is, if you compare it with what we've seen on Palestine, where basically everybody's voting yes now, what we've seen on the Ukraine, where it's a very mixed picture, Myanmar, of course, remaining very mixed. And then we have something else entirely going on here with the Iran human rights resolution from late last year. And I think this also highlights for all of us the range of different perspectives taken by foreign policy elites from across South and Southeast Asia as they seek to grapple with their own internal circumstances, what that means for their immediate neighborhood, and then, of course, what all of that translates to on the global stage. So just to wrap this up then, and I'll keep this really brief. My question was, how much do we all agree on the big question? So starting with Palestine, the level of agreement, I think somewhat profoundly, given everything else going on in the world, is now quite high. And no doubt that relates to some of the ways that compromise has been introduced into recent Palestine motions. And yet those resolutions, in contrast to what we see elsewhere, including for Ukraine, including for Myanmar, unsurprisingly. But what maybe is a bit surprising is that the ASEAN 10 are in fact less cohesive or consistent when it comes to their Myanmar answers to the big Myanmar questions than countries across South Asia. And then, of course, we have, I think, this great illustration of the level of discord that exists in the world right now when we look at the voting records on Iran's human rights situation. Australia, Timor-Leste and Myanmar, under its pre-military junta UN ambassador, being the only three of this sample voting yes. So lots more to say about all of this, but let me just end by noting that I think in looking closely at this kind of picture, looking at the voting outcomes that we've seen over time for Palestine, Ukraine, Myanmar, and indeed Iran, we should be asking ourselves other questions about the kind of conditions that we face globally right now. Of course, there are all sorts of reasons and ways that countries will explain their yeses, their abstentions and their no's. And yet I'd suggest this is actually quite a worrying landscape for everybody, requires serious attention if we are going to get beyond some of the superficial level of politeness in our foreign policy discussions and really start to get to grips with how we are going to ensure that the world in the years and decades to come doesn't spiral into out of control conflicts. And so on that somewhat grim note, Martine, I'll hand back to you in the room. Thanks again to AIIA Victoria for having me today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicholas. That was absolutely fascinating and really a good demonstration of how looking at some of the data to inform any possibilities for resolving some of these great conflicts jointly. And we'll come back to examine that information a little bit more closely. And I suspect this is probably not a bad segue, actually, to Grant Wyeth, the editor of the Asia-Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, because Grant's going to talk to us about what it looks like for Australia to strengthen its India-Oceania engagement.
Slides. I think we'll just, is the clicker working? Technical difficulties. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, I should first explain who we are. So Asia-Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, a bit of a mouthful. Our acronym is AP4D for anyone who wants to save a bit of time. We're a relatively new organisation, maybe approaching 3 years now, and where our primary goal is to promote a more integrated understanding of Australian foreign policy. So the idea is to bring development, diplomacy and defence together, and everything else that I guess doesn't begin with D, like trade. And our primary core product is options papers. So I've put a few up at the entrance there for you to take on our latest options paper, which is on Australia's Indian Ocean engagement. And I guess at the moment, our funding at the moment is via the Australian Civil Military Centre and via the Office of the Pacific, which is part of DFAT. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our latest options paper, which is all about Australia's Indian Ocean engagement. And it's really off the back of Australia's I guess if you look at some of the recent policy documents like the National Defence Strategy, how Australia is seeing its immediate region now as the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and now the Northeast Asian region. So we've been looking primarily at the maritime space there. So Maldives, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So we aren't going up into the landlocked countries with Nepal and Bhutan, and really going off where Australia sees its conception of the Indo-Pacific, which kind of runs a line down from Gujarat down through the ocean. That's a little bit problematic, but it's probably where thinking is in Canberra at the moment. So primarily we sought to try and find some perspectives, if I can get that word out, and really about understanding the broad political perspectives within the region. So India, it sees itself really as the natural power within the Indian Ocean region. It's heavily reliant on trade in the region, but it sees, unlike Australia, it sees its strategic zone as really going from the east coast of Africa right through to the Straits of Malaga, and especially with that focus on its archipelago of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are critical for maritime domain awareness. So while India has become the 5th largest economy in the world and has acquired significant naval capabilities, it's still a developing country. And although it has an increasing global reach, primarily it's still concerned with the building blocks of its own internal prosperity and development. And so it has a real focus on its needs with education, employment, infrastructure primarily. But we should also note that there has been a bit of a shift in Indian foreign policy over the last few years. So it still maintains its very strong independent streak and a commitment to strategic autonomy, but that's kind of evolved into more enthusiasm and greater interest in being actively involved with other partners, of which Australia is one, but also obviously the Quad with the United States and Japan as well. And it's seeing this as part of its broader engagement towards a more multipolar world. Bangladesh. So over the last kind of few decades, that they've had an incredible economic growth rate of around 7%, or as Chani mentioned, that might be a bit under threat at the moment. But this has really been on the back of their textiles industry as their primary driver of growth, and they're about to, in the next year or so, graduate out of least development status, but they have an objective to try and graduate to developed country status by the 2040s. But due to its manufacturing base, Bangladesh requires a consistent source of energy and raw materials. So this makes it heavily reliant on the open lines of sea lines of communication. With its stable rules and norms, and any threats to its sea lines of communication is really a kind of existential threat now for Bangladesh. But due to its unique geographic terrain, it's also highly susceptible to the effects of climate change, particularly in sea level rises, extensive flooding, and powerful cyclones, which we've just seen one over the last few days hitting Bangladesh and West Bengal in India as well. And so this makes climate adaptation and resilience really strong national priorities in Bangladesh. Sri Lanka, so with its location within the sea lines of communication, the Northwest Indian Ocean has given it a role as a major service hub in the region. And so this has raised its geopolitical weight. And after the conclusion of the Civil War in 2009, Sri Lanka has gained greater capacity to think about its external environment and its maritime interests. As Chani mentioned as well, the strengthening of democratic institutions and the rule of law is a priority, and the road to recovery from recent economic crisis is still having significant effects and going to affect the forthcoming elections as well. Sri Lanka has also, like India, maintained a long-standing non-aligned policy. But this is, with the increased great power competition in the region, that policy has come under greater stress, and especially trying to balance China's infrastructure investments in Sri Lanka with the concerns of India next door. Alongside this, as an island state, Sri Lanka has a keen interest in maritime safety and security, especially undersea cables, responding to natural disasters, and combating illegal fishing and tackling environmental issues. The Maldives. So when considering the Indian Ocean, we often conceptualize it just as the rim countries, but we should be paying attention to the small island states as well. And that's not just the Maldives, but that's Seychelles, Mauritius as well. Because these countries have a unique set of challenges that are reliant on the cooperation of larger states as well. So the primary security challenge for the Maldives is climate change. So rising sea levels are an existential threat. The capital, Mali, is just only 2.4 meters above sea level. So alongside the threat of climate change, the other core challenge is economic viability, which is something that Chani mentioned as well. The reliance on tourism, which is a vulnerable sector, with not only economic trends, but things like the pandemic and COVID-19 were a huge impact. And obviously the role of China in the strategic competition between China and India is seen as an opportunity, but it's also a risk as well, because it comes with great geopolitical complications. And India is heavily reliant on kind of good relations with Maldives, but sometimes it's not great at being diplomatic. And this has the effect of pushing Maldives a bit closer to China. Australia. So Australia's, as I mentioned before, Australia's recently added the Northeast Indian Ocean to its immediate region. However, the Northwest Australian coast is vastly underpopulated and lacks, it really lacks the infrastructure to project power and influence into that kind of quadrant of the ocean. But Australia has a direct interest in the stable and prosperous Indian Ocean. If you think about something like our strategic fuel reserves, which I think we've just upgraded to 27 days from 24 days, but that's still not great. It means that the flow of oil through the Indian Ocean is a vital national interest to Australia. This makes stability a key concern, not just competition between states, but things like poverty and disadvantage, which can spill over into instability and also into irregular migration. And I think last year was the most dangerous year for Rohingya at sea in a decade as well. So that's something that is of a serious concern to Australia. Australia has had limited cooperation with the countries in South Asia. That's improving though. However, there is something that Japan has done quite well because of the history in South Asia. Cooperation between South Asian states is not great, but being an honest outside broker is something that can work in Australia's favour, as Japan has demonstrated. So in our papers, we kind of offer some pathways on how Australia can engage more forcefully in the region or more cooperatively in the region. So I'll just run through a few of these. So first idea is having greater Defence Force Reserve regional partnerships. So the United States has a program called the US State Partnership Program, which facilitates civil military affairs between states. So an example being the Nevada National Guard has partnerships with Fiji and Tonga. Australia pursuing something similar would be a good way of increasing its engagement in Southeast Asia through the small island states. Increasing maritime awareness. So the Quad has a project, the Maritime Domain Awareness Project, but providing information and data to the fusion centres in Madagascar and the coordination centres in Seychelles would be a pathway that would greatly increase their capabilities. Defence diplomacy is another area. So at the moment, Australia only has one defence attaché for the whole of East Africa, who is based in Addis Ababa. So actually increasing our defence attaché presence in the East Coast to give that whole of Indian Ocean awareness would be a very low-cost way of increasing Australia's engagement in the region. The next is diaspora linkages. Obviously, over the last couple of decades, we've had a huge increase in our South Asia diaspora. This is able to form strong community links, bridge building links. Diaspora have a way of getting into, I guess, the nooks and crannies of countries that governments may not be able to get into. They have far greater economic understanding of their countries of origin. So that's a resource that we should be tapping far more significantly. That also leads to education as well. As I mentioned, India, but also the other countries in the region have huge demand for education at the moment. So Australia's done well in it. Deakin has just established a campus in India, Curtin in Mauritius, and Edith Cowan in Sri Lanka. But that also goes to understanding scholarships and student exchange through the Australia Awards and New Colombo plans. But also, I think, developing a strong Asia literacy through our school system and our university system. So at the moment, I think it's only ANU and La Trobe who teach Hindi. And I think that's a massive oversight, but you could also think of other, obviously Bengali, Tamil, Sinhalese are also languages that we should be spending far more resources on. And the final one is, I guess, piggybacking off a lot of the good work that we've done in the Pacific on illegal fishing and finding ways to engage to combat illegal fishing in the Indian Ocean as well. So one suggestion is to deny access to all out-of-region fishing vessels to Indian Ocean ports, which would make vessels that have come from South America and China, it would make it very economically unviable for them to fish in the Indian Ocean region. As we've seen in the Pacific, but it's also in the Indian Ocean as well, that a lot of communities are heavily reliant on fishing, and illegal fishing, obviously devastates a lot of people's economic well-being, but also devastates the sustainability of the fish populations in the region as well. So I'll leave it there, and yeah, I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Grant. It's been absolutely fascinating. And one of the, just on the theme of Asia literacy, I may as well inject a small commercial from AsiaLink on this matter. We've been battling this for many, many years, and to point out that one of the most important aspects of how we kind of work with one another and get to know one another, build trust, is through a better understanding of one another's languages and cultures. And it seems to be a big gap in Australia at the moment, still seen as a foreign policy matter rather than as a national capability matter. Alarming statistics on the decline in all kinds of studies, only 7 PhDs in Chinese studies in 2021. So it is a national capability question for us that we really must address and not consider it just as a trade and investment issue, which seems to be the tendency among our leaders at the moment. So a very, very handy message. Also, what all the 4 presentations spoke about was how deeply affected everyone is by conflicts that on the face of it might look remote, and how do we build resilience in those circumstances. And there is some areas of collaboration that are possible there, but indeed, as Nicholas pointed out, when you look at the record of voting on some of these key questions, the notion of working together to collectively manage these seems like a little bit of a very tall order. Now, we've got about 25 minutes, and I would like to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So I'm just going to ask you one question for the panel before we move into audience Q&A. And it relates something to, it really talks about choices. So Anil, in your presentation, you did speak about the shifting of certain groupings and collaborations to deal with, for example, the strategic challenge presented by China and growing Chinese power. And yet India, for example, has very carefully maintained its neutrality, including still doing business with Russia and Iran, also with Israel, with potentially domestic consequences for your population. So and ASEAN itself very studied in the way it doesn't want to be forced to be taking sides or be seen to be taking sides. It wants to be able to manage its relationships with both sides. But I'd like to ask all of you this one question: are we at a point where studied neutrality is the best way of getting through these things, or is there a need for more focused groupings that will actually address and deal with a specific problem? Otherwise, we just become sort of overrun by external circumstances. So I think I might start with you, Anil, on that question.
Yes, Martin, thank you for giving me the floor first. But let me start an answer to this question by saying that, if the UN today was functional in a way that we expect it to be, then countries would not be behaving in the way that they do today, because the United Nations is actually paralyzed in terms of any meaningful action it can take in any major conflict in the world, leave alone Russia, Ukraine. But you look at what's happening with the Israeli-Palestine situation as well. So the veto which is exercised in the United Nations actually kills all initiatives which other countries take. And we badly need a reform of the system in the United Nations. The same goes for the WTO, etc., where we see a similar paralysis. But having said that, I think, we have what has happened also is that there are a number of other groupings which have evolved over the years, depending on the circumstance in which countries find themselves. And as I mentioned when I was talking, the response to the Chinese aggression in the form of Quad or AUKUS, for that instance, is just a manifestation of how countries come together to actually counter a situation to the best of their ability. Now, in this case, they feel that they can come together and collectively tackle the situation. But individually today, what's happening is that because of the uncertainty in the world and the economic crisis which countries find themselves, because after COVID, we've had one crisis after another, economically, countries have become much more vulnerable, especially in the global south, in Africa, etc. So they need to find solutions which suit their own particular circumstances. And that's what drives them to take a position which is the best in given what the conflict is and what that situation is. And this is the reason why this is happening today. So coming back to your question, I think yes, I think that may be the best way of proceeding today. But when it comes to yet another global crisis, I think we should be prepared to take further action on it and not behave in the manner that we've done so far.
Chulani.
Yes, Martin, I think it's a very interesting question. We know it's when we are looking at a country's stance as an outsider, perhaps it's very easy for us to judge and say, perhaps this particular country should take a support or oppose a certain stance, which is popular. But if you look at from that country's perspective, they are obviously serving their own interests. They have to first consider their own interest. They have to answer to their own population first and foremost, before thinking about what the global community thinks of a particular stance. So that's why current conflicts, particularly the Israel-Palestine or Iran-Israel or Russia-Ukraine conflicts, have this deep divide when it comes to the responses from other countries. So as I mentioned in my presentation also, it's very clear, especially the small countries have had very good relationship with both sides who are in fighting at the moment. So they are not in a position to take a stance and say we support or oppose. So the best way for them to respond, considering their own interest, is the neutrality. I remember last 2 years, like I think the year before, when I was in Singapore, during one of the interviews I had to do for a European TV, I was asked like, isn't it unfair for India all the South Asian countries not to support the US stance on Russia when the conflict started. But then when you really look at it, for India, it has a very strong relationship, whether it's economic or even military-wise, with Russia. So would they want to jeopardize that because of the other countries? So I think I totally agree with what Ambassador Daniel said. If UN is what it was supposed to be, we won't be having any of these issues today. So we have to perhaps, in terms of responding to these issues as a global community, I think that's where we should start thinking about it.
Thank you. Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks, Martine. It's a great question. I'll keep it really brief. I agree with the two previous interventions that there's such complexity and such, sadly, institutional dysfunction that we're all struggling to find ways through some of these challenges. From an Australian perspective, though, I'd suggest that yes, we do need to actively make choices, and that's likely not going to get any easier. So we need to do it transparently. We need to do it honorably, meaning that wherever possible, we're doing things for the right reasons. And then over time, I think that should at least help to set some of the terms around which other countries can engage with Australia. And perhaps in the world that we live in, that's the best we can hope for. Thanks, Martine.
And Grant, one of those choices is to become more engaged.
More engaged, yeah. I agree with all the other speakers about understanding everyone else's interests and not just having a perspective of our own interests when we're engaging with these issues. But I think one thing that I think that may be able to overcome the barriers here, although I'm not very hopeful with it, is trying to understand conflicts from the perspectives of those most affected by it and not seeing everything in terms of great power politics. So, actually seeing Ukraine from the perspective of Ukrainians, not as great power politics between Russia and NATO or Russia and the US. Same with China and any potential invasion of Taiwan, to actually understand it from the Taiwanese perspective and not think of it as a competition between the US and China. I think that's a way that we can maybe strive to at least have, I guess, a different conceptual understanding of conflict, and a way we can try and find some solutions then where we actually think about people on the ground, and that goes for Palestine as well, rather than always thinking that it's always some great power competition. Because I think we tend to drift off into cynicism and conspiracy when we do that.
Thank you. So it's now over to the audience, and I will hand the microphone to Alistair, who's going to identify the questions, or you have your own microphone. Wow.
Well,
okay.
we'll come to Zara first, and I'll let Johanna go.
Sorry. Thank you, Zara Kimpton. One of the things that has not been addressed today is the fact that there is conflict between India and Pakistan. And we have heard a lot about the Maldives, Sri Lanka, smaller countries within the Indo-Pacific. But when we're looking also at the Middle East, Pakistan, for instance, would be having a different view to India. Why has Pakistan not, which is a very large country in its own right, not featured today?
Yes, I'm not going to. I'm the least qualified to answer this, so I'll put it over to anyone who'd like to.
In the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it's probably, as I said in my talk, Australia kind of draws its line of the Indo-Pacific down the west coast of India, so it's not really thinking about Pakistan. But I don't think that that's correct. I don't think that's a correct perspective, because obviously the Indian Ocean is a single strategic theater, but also the relationship between India and Pakistan is hugely influential on what happens within South Asia. Even you can't really get SAARC going now because of that relationship. So Absolutely, I absolutely agree that Pakistan should be in the conversation far more. I think maybe from an Australian perspective is we don't really see any opportunities in Pakistan at the moment, and that's probably where Canberra's thinking is, and Canberra's thinking probably is that seeking opportunities in Pakistan complicates the relationship with India, and India is the primary asset at the moment.
Middle East, where of course Pakistan would have stronger ties.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I guess that's also a failure of Australia's strategic landscape in not really understanding the Indian Ocean as this single strategic theatre.
Question in the middle.
Hello, all. I'm from Ukraine. I'm here due to war in Ukraine. For sometimes 19 years, I worked in Kiev Institute of International Relations. That's why I involved in problem of soft power and hard power. And now it looks like that weak state like Ukraine become more popular during last time on the third year of war. And the more attractive is image of the strong Russia. It's incredible, but hard power become popular. And many countries of global south supported not Ukraine, but our Russia Federation because it's more huge. And my question is, what do you think about global south and peaceful conference which will held in Switzerland in 15th of June this year? Many countries of global south said, no, we can't attend this conference. What do you thinking about this?
Well, I'll invite any speaker who'd like to jump in if they want to contribute to that.
So,
I might,
I would
please,
like
Ambassador
to, maybe I can say something on that, if I may. Martin, sorry, Alistair. Alistair, may I?
Please, yes, of course. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I have just 2 points to make on that peace conference. One is, Russia is not invited to the conference, and I wonder why that is, because when the chief protagonist is not there, what are we going to talk about in the absence of Russia? The second thing is that, it's up to Switzerland to invite countries, and if they want to invite anybody from the global south, they'll gladly attend or reject or whatever they feel like doing. But I think the invitations are limited, and that's what determines who attends and who doesn't.
Question coming here from Karen.
Like Zara with Pakistan, I was going to say the same thing about climate change, but then Grant brought it in as the last speaker, which I was relieved to hear. He mentioned the existential threat to the Maldives and also the need for adaptation, resilience in Bangladesh, though I think that might be an understatement. I think it might be an existential threat to a very large part of Bangladesh as well. And I was wondering if we should expand the focus on climate change in these regional security discussions. We didn't talk about, I don't think we talked about it in relation to India. And this week, Pakistan is having 50 degrees Celsius heat wave. I can't imagine what that's like. And then the threat of melting glaciers on a large part of the region. So I just wonder if any of the speakers would like to say more about the threat posed by climate change to regional security.
Anyone like to jump in?
Yes, that's a Great. That's a very considerable question. When I focused my presentation for this one, I did not ignore climate change on purpose or anything. Given the limited time frame, I try to sort of highlight the most concerning issues from these small countries. But I totally agree. This also, I think, highlights the importance of broadening our perspective on what security means for us. Is it only about protecting ourselves from a military conflict, or whether it is something broader than that, economic conflict and climate change? Definitely, South Asia is one of the most vulnerable regions when it comes to climate change. And it's not only because of the weather changes that's happening, but other issues, how it is impacting the economy, and even leading for climate refugees in the region. For instance, I know in Sri Lanka in particular, as a result of climate issues, our agricultural industry is facing a lot of strain. And food security is one of the major concerns when it comes to this. So definitely, I think in future, when we are discussing security, we should probably broaden our perspective and include climate change as one of the key components in our discussion.
We've probably got two more. Got Riley, and then come to Jean.
Thank you for an insightful discussion. My question is about the I2U2 minilateral that is forming between India, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and who's the other U? I2, India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, of course. And linking this conversation of where is Pakistan and where is the Middle East in the Indian Ocean security aspect, where do you see the I2U2 network going? Has it been compromised by the Gaza war? Are there any future opportunities there for maybe the small South Asian states to kind of jump in? Because I know there's been a lot of technical deals going on with Israel, especially in the defense sector. And where do you see this alliance and this evolving security relationship between South Asia and the Middle East going?
So may I just try and attempt to answer that question, Alistair?
Please do, Ambassador. Thank you.
Yeah, so, when the I2U2 was launched, it was doing pretty well in the first couple of years, in fact, for the first 3 years, because there were at least 4 substantive projects that were agreed upon. They have been implemented as well, and they're related to food security and irrigation technologies, which have all been very successful. The future projects were supposed to be more on the connectivity front. And we have seen how the IMEC has been put on the back burner now because the port of Haifa has come out of the equation because of the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And the I2U2 similarly, suffers from lack of Israeli participation because they cannot participate to the extent that they would like to do so now in these circumstances. But of course, the projects are there and they're being discussed. Now the next project was supposed to be undertaken for food security in the UAE. So they're much more interested in it because it's because of the imports of food grain, for example, which happen in the region. How to grow fruits, for example, or vegetables with hydroponics. That's the concentration of this project. And that's the major project that we're working on. But again, it involved Israeli participation. So for the moment, I think it's going to be on the back burner, but it'll come back and it'll be taken up again once things stabilize.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we've got time for one more question, so we'll come to Jean. Here's a microphone there.
Thank you. I agree with what everybody's saying about how we really don't have any great answers to all the problems that we're looking at. But I remember when we had the non-aligned nations, which was Indonesia, India, and others, who were actually discussing ways to stop war, to have more equitable societies. And that all seems to have vanished. We hear about security. Nobody tells us what security means. What is it? Who are we being secure from and how? It's just that we have to spend a lot of money on security. I'd like, if anyone can answer me, about what did happen to the non-aligned nations and if we could resurrect any of those peace talks.
So anyone like to take on what happened to the non-aligned movement?
Yeah, I can attempt something, and maybe Julani can supplement that. But I think the non-aligned movement it exists. They still meet in summits, etc. The only problem with the non-aligned movement is that there is no implementation for what you adopt. And that's the main drawback there, because over the years, the communique has become longer and longer because the problems in the world obviously have increased, and everybody wants to put in their bit into the communique. But the solutions for that also need to be discussed, and how they need to be solved and where they have to be taken and to be addressed. And that's the main question. So the outlet for that is the G77 plus China grouping in the United Nations, where it is ultimately taken to in the form of resolutions. But not all the problems can find their way into these resolutions in the end, and not many of them can be passed unanimously. So that's the problem. And that's why countries have sort of lost a little bit of interest there. There are many other groupings which have come up. There are smaller groupings, much more cohesive and much more result-oriented. And that's how I look at it.
I'm going to have a crack at this one too, because I think what Anna just said right at the end is that where some of the solutions probably lie is that there are issue-specific alliances now, like how to manage the effects of climate change, energy security. There are making communities more resilient, development objectives, helping nations protect them against illegal fishing. There's a whole group of really important issues that affect national interests and particular interests of states that can be functional alliances that yield real results, that I think probably overall have yielded more promise than a very large group of non-aligned countries that have so many different interests and only one thing in common, which is that they're non-aligned and they've got something against the big five. And that has, just like the United Nations, that has been sort of mugged by reality in terms of all the competing interests in these organizations. So to my mind, some of these complex problems that we've identified today and the unintended consequences of conflicts that seem to be remote but that affect directly, in particularly the small countries, can be met in part by some of these functional alliances to actually deal with specific topics across the board, including on climate.
Could I ask you then, I think we've probably covered our time. Could I ask you to briefly wrap up if that was your plan, or?
I just did.
Yes, okay. You're happy to, that's good. Well, I think on that note, thanking all the panelists, thanking Martine for running the conversation. Thank you to Ambassador Anil for joining us. Nick, likewise, thank you. Grant and Jelani, really good. I mean, it's been a huge geographic area we covered and a huge topic. And from the AIA perspective, thank you all very much for your interest.